Okay, before we get into the various sources of public financing, I want us to discuss a few principles related to public financing, and they are equity and efficiency. So, when we refer to equity in regards to public financing, essentially we are asking these questions. Is this fair and is this equitable? The goal should really be to develop a form of public financing that is considered equitable and efficient. Now, that doesn't always happen, but this is kind of the ideal, right? In an ideal scenario, we want to select forms of public financing that are both equitable and efficient. Um, so there's a few principles related to equity that I want us to look at. First is this concept of vertical equity, which vertical equity, in terms of fairness, exists when you are not unfairly burdening poor people to finance a project. So, for instance, studies have shown that poor people are more likely to spend the disposable income they do have on things like cigarettes, alcohol, lottery tickets. So, if a city rolls out sin tax, then they are not fulfilling the vertical equity principle, right? Because they are burdening the poor unfairly in order to finance that facility. Horizontal equity principle essentially means that individuals with similar income should pay similar amounts of tax. So if you're using a tax to finance a facility, you would want to make sure that those folks with similar income levels are paying a similar amount of tax. So you can use a property tax, for example, right? If a property tax is being utilized to help fund a sport facility, then the city would need to create a property tax where all the houses in the same area or neighborhood are paying the same rate. And if they are, then they've fulfilled that horizontal equity principle. Finally, this benefit principle, which is the one that I want us to focus on the most as we think about these different forms of public financing. The benefit principle states that those who use or benefit from a particular financing project should be the ones who are taxed. So it's pretty straightforward, right? Those who directly benefit from a new stadium or arena should be the ones paying the bill, not those that are not interested in going to or using the facility. So the benefit principle is the one that I want us to really focus on as we think about these different sources of public financing. And really, anytime you're looking at a proposal for public financing, these questions should be asked, right? Is the benefit principle fulfilled? Are the ones using the facility the one actually footing the bill? And as you'll find, I think that's not always the case with some of the different forms of public financing. Great example of that here. The New York Yankees built a new facility back in the 2000s, got a lot of pushback for all of the public funds that they utilized through sales tax in New York City. And if you look here at kind of the breakdown of where Yankees fans were located at the time in terms of where they lived, you actually see that only 33% of Yankees fans were actually living in one of the 5 boroughs in New York City, right? And that actually most of their fans were coming from either suburbs or nearby states. So if you look at this data and kind of go back and ask ourselves this question about the benefit principle, they weren't really fulfilling it, right? Because the people paying that tax in the city were not necessarily those Yankees fans attending games, right? So just one example of how the benefit principle may not be fulfilled. Okay, so we talked about this concept of equity. We also have to identify this concept of efficiency, right? So again, we want any form of public financing to fulfill equity and efficiency. So cities have to be pretty careful about the different forms of public financing they roll out. And taxes tend to be a pretty common form. Now, in terms of efficiency, taxes are pretty easy to understand. They're pretty easy to implement, right? As long as they fulfill their purpose without actually harming the business. So this is kind of the line that cities and municipalities have to balance. So this concept of price elasticity of demand comes into play. So basically, you don't want to tax businesses and services to a point where their demand for those products actually goes down because the taxes have increased the price so much. So Essentially, what we're looking here is you want to see a 0% change in demand for every increase in price, right? So that's what we're looking to assess when we think about the efficiency of a tax. So price elasticity of demand is the decrease in the number of units sold when the price goes up. So we can actually look and see, if you implement a hotel tax and, the number of rooms per night goes down repeatedly, then we can see that there is not necessarily a very elastic demand for that particular product. In other words, cities should try to tax products and services that have what we call a low or close to zero price elasticity of demand. So again, this is kind of hard to gauge, right? Because there are a lot of factors that might play a role in demand. But basically, if you're a city and your goal is to raise a certain amount of income with the tax increase, then you have to be sure that that increase in price isn't going to hurt demand to the point that you don't actually raise the money, right? And also that you don't hurt businesses within your community. And ultimately, the goal here should be to be somewhere around 0% in terms of price elasticity of demand. Now, there may be a little bit of movement in demand when there's a tax that would be expected, but you want to stay as close to zero as possible. Okay, so let's now identify some of the public sources of financing. We essentially have two categories of public financing, bonds and direct revenues. So bonds are essentially loans that the city takes out against itself or through some other kind of source. Either way, the city or state is responsible for paying that loan debt back with interest. Direct revenues, on the other hand, typically come in the form of taxes. So the city is collecting the money through taxpayers and then using it to fund the facility project. Again, some of these taxes or sources are going to fulfill the benefit principle, others do not. We're just going to highlight each of these sources now and sort of think about some of the advantages and disadvantages to each. Okay, so let's start by looking at some of the bonds. So I mentioned general obligation bond earlier. These are essentially long-term loans that the city is taking out against itself, right? So historically, this is the most common form of public financing used by cities to fund stadium construction. Again, it allows the city to take out a long-term loan from the city pool of money. So, think about any city or municipality. They generate money through property taxes and sales taxes, and that money goes into a general fund. Again, there are a lot of things that fund could be used for, but one common way is that the city would take out a general obligation bond to fund a sport facility and essentially borrow that money to pay for the facility. Over time, they pay that loan back with interest. These are typically considered to be fairly low risk bonds, right? The money's coming directly from the city coffers, it's already there. Another kind of advantage to this particular type of financing is that you have a long time to pay off the debt. These are typically 20 to 30 year loans. So the money doesn't have to be gathered overnight. Now, there are several disadvantages to general obligation bonds. One is basically a barrier or hurdle, right? It requires voter approval. So that means that either the city council members have to vote to approve it, or in some cases, a vote by the residents has to exist in order to approve it. So it's not something that, a city official can just decide based on conversations they've had with a sports team. Generally, there is some kind of voting barrier in order to get it approved. And as we talked about earlier, it's a lot of negative connotation surrounding public financing these days, so it can be difficult to convince the public to move something like this forward. Probably the biggest disadvantage of a general obligation bond is that, as I mentioned, that pool of funds that the city gathers is meant to be used on a number of things to better the community, right? Education, roads, all of these other things that we think about when we pay tax dollars, we think about that money going towards. So if the money is going towards financing a sport facility, that's money that can't be used in other places. And actually, if you followed the Raiders' recent move to Vegas, and if you followed any of that facility financing in the news, you've probably seen that there was a lot of negative press on this, right? Because essentially they got a huge chunk of their financing from the city through general obligation bonds. And the city voted to approve it, while at the same time they voted to make cuts in the school system. So obviously that's a bad look for any city to be, putting money towards building a sport facility while also making cuts to education. But again, there's only a limited amount of money to go around in that pool of funds. So that's a little bit about general obligation bonds. Again, historically, these have been pretty common sources to finance sport facilities. I think we're starting to see them become less common because of some of these disadvantages we identified. All right, so another form of bond is a revenue bond. So these are bonds that are paid off specifically from a well-defined source of revenue. So basically, a revenue bond is when the city defines a specific line of revenue and agrees to use that line of revenue to pay for a sport facility project. So unlike general obligation bonds where you're using the money from the city's fund, here you are relying on a specific line of revenue that maybe doesn't exist yet, but you predict that it will in the future. So again, this could be a good source of financing, right? And if we think about that the benefit principle, this is much more likely to fulfill that benefit principle than, say, a general obligation bond, right? Where every citizen is having to pay taxes towards the funding. By using a revenue bond, they can allocate specific revenue that deals with the city, right? Deals with the sports stadium. So it could be revenue from parking. It could be a revenue from a lease that the team is paying. These could be specific sources that are defined, which again, if you have them aligned specifically with the sports stadium, it fulfills that benefit principle. Another advantage of revenue bonds is that there's generally no vote required, right? So less red tape here for a city to actually enact a revenue bond. In terms of disadvantages, these can be viewed as kind of risky, right? Because, like I said earlier, oftentimes they're planning to use a line of revenue that may or may not exist yet, right? Especially if it's dealing specifically with the sports facility. You're going to charge a ticket surcharge, or you're going to charge, you're going to gather money from parking. Well, you don't know if you're going to sell tickets or actually sell parking spots, right? So it could be a little bit risky to rely on a source of revenue that doesn't exist yet. And because of that, these revenue bonds do tend to have higher interest rates, again, because the revenue meant to pay them back doesn't necessarily exist and can't be assured. All right. Another form of public financing here is tax increment financing. Basically here you're using an additional or new property tax in order to finance a facility. So typically tax increment financing or these new property taxes are put on areas near or where the sports stadium arena is going to be built. Right, so those living in that community take on a new property tax in addition to their existing taxes. Now, does this fulfill the benefit principle? Some might argue that it does, right? That if you're building a nice, new, shiny sport facility in someone's neighborhood, that will ultimately increase their home values, right? And that's certainly the argument that is made for cities when they're adding a property tax to someone's bill. So it certainly helps with public persuasion to make that case. And again, there are mixed studies here on to whether or not home values actually increase because of a sports stadium or arena in a particular neighborhood. There are a lot of factors that play into that. But generally, tax increment financing, you could argue, perhaps does fill the benefit principle if those homes are actually seeing, an improvement on their home values over time. And also if they're, in walking distance to the stadium arena, they also get the chance to access and use it. All right. Another very common public source of revenue here is a sales tax, right? So sales tax, you're probably familiar with, is basically any tax on the sale of goods within a particular city or county. This tends to be one of the more common sources of public financing when we're building stadiums or arenas. And the reason is, by using a sales tax, you have the ability to really collect a small amount of money from a large amount of people, right? So you could have even a 1% increase on a sales tax that everyone is paying within a community. And by spreading it out to all of the citizens in that community, it becomes a little bit easier to raise the funds, right? You're not totally reliant on one particular group of people. Now, as you can imagine, that brings into question this concept of the benefit principle, right? Because if we're taxing everyone in a community, we can't really say that we are fulfilling the benefit principle, right? Because certainly not every citizen in a particular city is a fan of that team or wants to finance that team's facility. So sales tax can be really useful and does allow the city to spread out the financing across a large subset of the population. But there are questions about whether or not that actually fulfills the benefit principle. There are essentially two different methods for implementing a sales tax. You can do a pay-as-you-go method, so that's as the sales tax is collected from the local businesses, or you can do a government bond payback, where essentially the government fronts the money and then it's paid back to them over time. Again, this is pretty common if you're familiar or paying attention to, again, St. Louis sports recently. You can see that they recently secured an MLS team. I've been following their facility financing plan, and part of it is to implement a sales tax, so a local tax that is going to help cover that stadium construction. So again, this is still a pretty common method. Okay, another form of public financing is a tourism tax. So tourism tax, as you might imagine, is a tax that primarily impacts non-residents, a tax that impacts tourists, right? People that are visiting a particular community for a short period of time. Excuse me. So here you can see a couple of examples, right? So common tourism taxes would be things like hotel tax, things like a rental car tax. These are things that we think of when we think of tourists, right? These are things that probably only tourists are using or primarily tourists are using. So it makes sense to tax those items. Sometimes you also see a food and beverage tax included in a tourism tax plan. Now keep in mind that locals also eat at restaurants, right? So it gets a little bit tricky to call that a tourism tax fully, right? Because not only are tourists impacted by that, but also local residents. So certainly hotel tax and rental car tax would fulfill this tourism tax. And then you can make a case that food and beverage tax also impacts tourists, but you have to be careful about fully calling that a tourism tax. Now, certainly there are some advantages to using a tourism tax, right? It becomes a lot easier to pass a tourism tax, easier case to make to your residents, right? Because they're not the ones who are going to be footing the bill for that tax. It's mostly going to be on people that don't live in that community. So the public persuasion is a little bit easier when it comes to implementing a tourism tax than, let's say, a sales tax would be. With that said, there are certainly some risks or disadvantages to implementing a tourism tax, right? If tourism taxes are common in your city, then they're probably also common in other cities, right? So, having a lot of tourism taxes across the country means really, wherever you travel, you're going to be impacted by those tourism taxes, and it becomes more and more expensive to travel to big cities that also happen to have sports stadiums and arenas. So ultimately, we're all impacted. Another probably key risk or disadvantage to having a tourism tax in place is that, if tourism taxes creep up high enough, then tourism potentially can decline, right? Meaning it's become too expensive to visit a particular city. We're going to look at an example of a city where this essentially has happened here over the last decade. But do want to ask this question first is, do we think the tourism tax fulfills the benefit principle? And I think if you think hard enough about it, the answer is probably no, right? We can't assume that every person that's traveling to a particular city is doing so to go see a sports team, right? There are a number of reasons why people travel, and sports is not necessarily the number one reason, right? They might be traveling to see family, they might be traveling to go to a business conference. There are all sorts of reasons people travel. So it would be hard to make the case that the tourism tax fulfills the benefit principle, because we certainly can't make the case that all tourists are benefiting from a sport facility or a stadium. I mentioned that there's a good example of, a city where a tourism tax has potentially made an impact in, people traveling to that community. And that community is Indianapolis. So if we go back here several years, we can look at the financing of Lucas Oil Stadium, right? This is where the Colts play in Indianapolis. And if we look at this breakdown here of the financing sources they use, you can see that everything that has a blue arrow next to it was a tourism tax. So this was a facility that relied heavily on a tourism tax or several tourism taxes to finance it. And I've done the breakdown for you over here, right? I've added together all of the sources that came from a tourism tax. You can see that if you take that total and divide it by the total funding sources, 68% of the financing for Lucas Oil Stadium came from a tourism tax, right? That's a huge chunk of money coming specifically through that tourism tax source. So what is the impact of this over time? Well, we can see that it's become really expensive to travel to Indianapolis as opposed to maybe some of the other cities in the Midwest or in this region. And it's having an impact on, whether or not people decide to travel there. You can see just in this first paragraph here, visitors pay among the highest travel taxes in the nation when they come to Indianapolis. 17% on hotel rates, 15% on rental cars, and 9% on meals. So, you might traditionally think of Indiana as a place that's pretty affordable in terms of cost of living, but it's actually very expensive to travel there and spend any time. And a lot of that comes back to the financing that occurred with Lucas Oil Stadium. So again, these things have real life implications on the communities and cities in which they spring from. So it's important for us to think about those implications. Okay. Another source of public financing here that I think we alluded to a little bit earlier is a sin tax. So these are taxes on products and services that tend to be socially undesirable, right? Or have this concept of sin associated with them. So you can see the common sin taxes are taxes on cigarettes, taxes on alcohol, taxes on the lottery also tend to be classified as sin taxes. So these are less common than general sales tax, and I think we identified these kinds of taxes as not really fulfilling that vertical equity principle earlier, right? Given the subsets of population who tend to purchase these products, they certainly hard to make the case that sin taxes meet the benefit principle, right? There's no guarantee that the people purchasing these items are also going to be using the sports facilities or arenas. So while they can be utilized to offset costs for a sport facility, they're not necessarily meeting that benefit principle. Okay, I'm going to pause here and then do one more video lecture, a much shorter one, I promise, on private sources of financing. But we spent a lot of time here talking about these different sources of public financing, and do want you to note that there are other sources of public financing out there. I just highlighted some of the common ones. I think the key takeaway with the public financing conversation is that, yes, there will continue to be public sources of financing used to fund sport facilities in the U.S., but it's becoming, I think, increasingly important that the people involved in putting these arrangements together, that they consider both the efficiency and equity of those sources, right, and determine whether or not they actually fulfill that benefit principle.